Good evening, my friends. The storm outside is fierce tonight, with the rain pouring down and thunder rolling in the distance. But as you listen to this story, let it be a gentle escape, a gift to help calm your mind and ease you into a peaceful sleep. Close your eyes, let the world fade away, and allow the story to carry you into a place of rest. Sweet dreams await. The night fell quickly, the sun disappearing behind the thick blanket of clouds that seemed to have settled over the campsite. The group of us had been hiking for hours, the winding trails through the woods wearing us down, but we finally found the perfect spot, a secluded area by a small bubbling creek where we could set up camp for the night. We pitched our tents, set up the fire, and the familiar sounds of crackling wood and the rustling of the trees filled the air. The kind of peaceful night we had all hoped for. It wasn't long before we were gathered around the fire, laughing and talking. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of the creek and the occasional snap of a branch. The fire's light flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the trees, adding to the sense of isolation and serenity that surrounded us. For the first time in a while, I felt relaxed, almost at peace. I called dibs on the last marshmallow. Jake grinned, holding a roasting stick with a perfectly golden marshmallow at the end. Not so fast, Sarah teased, trying to swipe the stick from his hand. I'm getting that one. The easy banter continued, but there was something else in the air, a tension I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the isolation, the feeling of being so far from civilization. Or maybe it was the way the firelight seemed to twist the shadows into strange shapes, creating illusions in the corners of my vision. I looked up at the sky. The stars were hidden behind the clouds, and I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything had become. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, distant owl calls were absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Guys, do you hear that? I asked, my voice breaking the silence. I strained my ears, listening for anything, but there was only the faint hiss of the wind. Hear what? Mark replied, his eyes glancing nervously around the camp. Nothing. Never mind, I said, brushing it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It was probably just the quiet of the night playing tricks on me. Still, that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I forced a smile and reached for my own marshmallow stick. But just as I was about to take a bite, I heard it. A faint sound, too faint at first to be sure. It was a scraping noise, a gentle rustling, like something or someone was moving just outside the circle of light. I froze. Did you hear that? I whispered, looking toward the trees. The others stopped, looking at me, their faces momentarily serious. Then Jake broke the silence with a nervous laugh. It's probably just an animal. No need to get spooked. But it didn't feel like an animal. It felt different. It felt intentional. I glanced around at my friends, but no one seemed to have noticed the change in the air. Sarah was still toasting her marshmallow. Mark was sipping his water, and Jake was poking at the fire. I stared into the darkness, heart racing, but there was nothing except the shadows. Shadows that seemed to stretch farther now, deeper into the trees. Then for a moment, I thought I saw it, a figure, tall, dark, standing just outside the edge of the firelight. It was too far away to make out any features, but its presence was undeniable. The shape seemed to move, and I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. When I looked back, it was gone. I didn't say anything. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. As the night wore on, the tension didn't ease. Every rustle in the trees, every flicker of shadow seemed to draw my attention. And every time I looked away, the darkness seemed a little bit closer. The night wore on, but sleep refused to come. The wind had picked up again, rustling through the trees and making the branches creak. But it wasn't the wind that kept me awake. It was the silence, the way the air felt heavy, like something was waiting for us, watching us. The fire had burned down to just embers now, casting faint flickering shadows across our small campsite. The rain had started earlier, light at first, but it quickly grew more intense, falling in heavy sheets that slashed through the air. The sound of the raindrops hitting the tents was nearly deafening, but it was the quiet in between, the moments when the rain paused, that had me on edge. It wasn't until I heard the rustling again that I dared to speak. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Sarah, who was curled up in her sleeping bag beside me. She looked up, blinking in the dim light. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, trying to make out the noise. There it was again, that soft scraping, like something dragging along the ground, moving closer to our tents. It was too deliberate to be the wind. "Shh." I put my finger to my lips, trying to silence her before I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The others were asleep, or at least pretending to be. The only sound in the camp was the heavy rain, the thrum of it against the fabric of the tents. But in the still moments between raindrops, I could hear it again, scrape, rustle. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever it was moving just beyond the tents, close enough for me to hear, but not close enough for me to see. The shadows from the trees danced wildly in the wind, and every time lightning flashed, the dark shapes outside the camp seemed to shift and move. I tried to keep calm. My mind raced, trying to explain it away. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was just the wind. But something told me it wasn't. Something about the way the noise persisted, how it seemed to come closer with every passing moment, felt wrong. I slowly unzipped my tent, careful not to wake the others, and stepped outside into the pouring rain. The cold hit me instantly, biting through my clothes as I scanned the area around us. The woods were thick with shadows, and the trees seemed to loom higher than I remembered, their branches swaying like dark hands reaching for me. I crept forward, my feet sinking into the wet ground with every step, trying to make as little noise as possible. The forest seemed dead silent now, the only sound the heavy rain and the distant thunder. My breath was shallow, my mind spinning with every possible worst-case scenario. Then, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw it, a figure. For a second, I thought it was one of my friends, but the shape didn't move like a person. It stood completely still, tall and slender, the silhouette almost indistinguishable from the shadows that surrounded it. And when the lightning flashed, the figure didn't flinch. It was watching me. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. My mouth went dry as I took a step back, trying to get back to the tent. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, as though it was waiting for something. Suddenly, a sharp rustling broke the silence. Too close. My body tensed, and I whipped around, looking for the source of the sound. But nothing was there. I looked back at the figure. It was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the empty woods. But when I finally forced myself to turn around, the firelight was barely visible through the pouring rain. I stumbled back toward the tents, my heart pounding. The figure was gone, but something felt even more wrong now, like the entire forest was closing in on me. When I crawled back into the tent, I was drenched, my hands shaking as I tried to dry them off. I couldn't look out into the woods anymore, not without feeling like something was watching me. The figure was gone, but the feeling remained, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I turned to Sarah, who was still wide awake, eyes filled with concern. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "What happened? What did you see?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I didn't know how to explain it. The figure, the feeling that we weren't alone, the terror that seemed to crawl under my skin. I looked back at the others, still asleep, oblivious to what I had seen. "We need to leave," I finally said, my voice low. "Something's wrong with this place. We're not safe here." But Sarah just stared at me, wide-eyed. "What are you talking about? It's just a storm, just rain. It's nothing." But I could see it in her eyes too. She felt it. Whatever it was, we weren't alone. The rain hadn't let up, it only intensified. The downpour relentless, as the thunder cracked so violently, the ground beneath us seemed to shake. The storm was no longer a distant force. It was here, pressing in on us, drowning out every other sound. The wind howled through the trees, bending them almost as if they were bowing to some unseen power. Inside the tents we huddled together, the fabric flapping in the wind, the only source of light coming from the weak glow of our flashlights. The shadows inside the tent seemed to stretch unnaturally, flickering with every burst of lightning. We hadn't spoken much after I came back from the woods, drenched and trembling. I couldn't explain what I had seen. Not really. What could I say? There was a figure out there just beyond the firelight, and when I tried to look at it, it vanished. I could tell Sarah wanted to ask questions, but we both knew it didn't matter. The storm outside was growing fiercer, the rain pounding harder, and the tension inside the tent was suffocating. We couldn't go out in that, not with the storm so bad, and definitely not with whatever was out there. But the longer we stayed in the tent, the worse it got. The feeling of being watched. It wasn't just me anymore. We all felt it. Dylan, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. I keep hearing things outside. I turned toward her, my breath catching in my throat. What kind of things? I don't know, she said, her voice shaking, like rustling, scraping, like something's moving around the tents. She paused, her eyes wide. I swear I heard footsteps. I felt my stomach drop. I had heard it too. The rustling, the scraping against the ground, like someone was moving just beyond the edge of the fire. I had tried to convince myself it was just the storm, just the wind, but it wasn't. I pushed the thought out of my mind. It's just the wind, it's fine. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. I could hear the footsteps too, soft, barely perceptible, but there. And they weren't following the pattern of the wind. They were deliberate, like someone was pacing outside, moving around the tents, as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Mark, Jake, I said, my voice low and tight. You guys hear that too? There was a long pause. Then Jake, who had been lying quietly, suddenly shifted. Yeah, he said, his voice flat. I've been hearing it for a while now. I thought I was just imagining it. Mark's voice followed, shaky. What the hell's out there? There's nothing in the woods. There can't be. The sound came again, louder this time. A soft scraping, like something dragging against the ground, followed by faint steps crunching the wet leaves. I was sure of it now. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just the storm. There was something or someone out there. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like the drum of war. I tried to control my breathing, tried to ignore the panic rising in me, but I couldn't. The more I listened, the clearer it became. Someone was circling us. Scrape, step, scrape, step. I forced myself to sit up, pushing the rain-soaked tent flaps aside, just enough to peek out into the darkness. The world outside was almost completely swallowed by the storm. Flashes of lightning revealed fleeting glimpses of the trees, their branches twisting wildly. Nothing but shadows. But the footsteps, they didn't stop. They kept coming, slow, measured, like something was circling us just out of sight. Someone's out there, I said quietly, my voice trembling. Get the flashlight, Jake hissed, his voice rising in panic. We have to look. We need to know what's out there. But something inside me resisted. I didn't want to know. The thought of shining a light out there into the forest filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. Because if I did, if I looked, I knew I would see it. The thing I had seen before. The thing that had been watching us. But I knew I couldn't wait much longer. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, my fingers cold and shaking as I flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the rain and the dark, illuminating the trees just outside the tent. Nothing but the scraping, the footsteps. They were closer now. Turn off the light, Sarah whispered urgently. It'll see us. I didn't listen. I couldn't. I needed to know. I needed to see what was out there before it was too late. And then there it was. A shadow, a movement. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. The shape was too tall, too thin. The head hung low, but the figure was still moving, swaying, like it was being dragged forward by some invisible force. And then it stopped, dead still. I could feel its gaze on me. I didn't need to see its eyes. I could feel them burning into me, like it was trying to reach through the walls of the tent and grab me. My breath caught in my throat. I could hardly breathe, the air in the tent thick with fear. The figure stood there, just outside the light, and I couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed at me to turn off the flashlight, to hide, to do anything. But I couldn't. The figure wasn't moving. It was waiting. For what? I didn't know, but I didn't dare to wait and find out. The silence stretched too long, suffocating, until it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure outside the tent stood perfectly still, its form impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and that feeling, that crushing, suffocating weight, only grew heavier as the seconds passed. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound deafening in my ears, drowning out the storm, drowning out everything else. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, each intake of air more desperate than the last. But it wasn't enough. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move. It didn't even shift. It just watched. The wind howled outside, but all I could hear was the sound of the rain pounding against the tents and the distant rumble of thunder. My hands were cold, and I gripped the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. The beam trembled in my hand as I held it toward the opening, but it didn't make a difference. I knew what was out there. I knew what I had seen. And then, in the heart of the storm, there was a noise, a soft scrape like something or someone dragging its feet along the wet ground. It wasn't just any scrape. It was coming closer, and this time the sound was joined by something else, a whisper, a voice. Come. It was faint at first, barely audible over the roar of the storm, but it grew louder with each passing second, the voice becoming clearer, the words more distinct. I could feel it deep in my bones, a cold shiver running through my spine. Come closer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn and run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the figure outside the tent. And the voice, that voice, it felt like it was pulling me, beckoning me to step into the dark, into the forest where the shadows waited, where the thing waited. The figure took a step forward. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. One slow, deliberate step. Come, we've been waiting for you. The voice now filled my mind, like it was speaking directly to me, drowning out everything else. I could feel its presence, pressing against me, suffocating me. The shadows were reaching inside the tent, stretching toward me, and I knew, if I moved, if I stepped out into the rain, into the woods, I would never come back. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, like something slamming against the side of the tent. I jumped, and in that moment of panic, I turned the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating the edge of the tent. And that's when I saw it, a hand, a thin, bony hand, pale, almost translucent, reaching through the fabric of the tent, the fingers long and crooked, curled like claws. The hand scraped against the tent, dragging itself forward, and I felt a cold chill run through me like ice. The others started screaming. Jake's voice cracked in terror. Mark was fumbling for his backpack, trying to gather his things. Sarah was shaking, her face pale with fear, her hands pressed to her mouth, as though trying to stifle the scream that was building inside her. It's here, Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the rain. What the hell is that thing? I didn't know. I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. It was impossible. The figure outside the tent wasn't human. The hand was too thin, too cold. It didn't belong to anything that walked the earth. The whispers grew louder, until it felt like the very air was thick with them. Come closer. You cannot escape. I knew we had to move. We had to run. But the moment we moved, the shadows would claim us. I could feel it. I could feel the darkness pulling us in, pulling me in. And then, the figure spoke again. This time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was a command, a demand that sliced through the air like a blade. That enter the forest, enter the darkness. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. The hand outside the tent was moving, crawling, stretching toward us like a twisted puppet on invisible strings. Suddenly, the air shifted. The wind stopped. The rain ceased, as though it had been paused. For a brief moment, everything fell silent, too silent, and I realized the figure wasn't the only thing outside. The woods had come alive, too. The trees were no longer swaying in the wind. They were moving, slowly, creaking and groaning like they were alive, like they were part of whatever was out there. The forest had opened its eyes. The silence was suffocating. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The wind had stopped howling. The rain had stopped falling. The only sound was my ragged breathing, the only movement the twitching of my fingers as I gripped the flashlight, my hands slick with sweat. The shadows outside the tent moved closer, like the forest was pulling itself toward us, reaching out with gnarled, twisted branches that seemed to stretch longer with every heartbeat. The figure, whatever it was still standing outside, just beyond the edge of the light. its tall, thin shape looming like some ancient predator, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel its gaze digging into me, pulling me toward it. Come closer, the voice whispered again, softer now, almost pleading. You can't escape. I turned to the others. Sarah was still sitting frozen, her eyes wide with terror. Mark was gripping his flashlight, but his hands were trembling so violently, I was afraid he would drop it. Jake, the bravado he'd had earlier now, completely gone, was staring at the fabric of the tent, like it would open up and swallow him whole. We were trapped. I looked at the opening of the tent, where the hand had been, and it was moving again, scraping against the fabric, dragging itself along like a thing that had no right to be in this world. It wasn't just the hand. The entire forest seemed to be reaching for us. The trees were bending, their branches twisting into shapes that didn't belong in nature, like they were being guided by something dark, something that was alive. We need to leave, I said, my voice shaking with fear. I was standing now, heart racing, eyes darting between the entrance of the tent and my friends. But none of us moved. None of us could move. It felt like the forest was holding us in place, like the ground had turned to stone beneath us. Then, just as I was about to shout again, the whispers came, louder this time, a chorus of voices all speaking at once. Come to us. Join us forever. It wasn't just the figure outside anymore. The entire forest was speaking. The shadows, the trees, the ground beneath us. Everything was alive. Everything was waiting. Without warning, I stepped back, stumbling over the tent's edge. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The shadows outside grew bolder, stretching toward the tent, and the cold that swept through the fabric of the tent was unnatural. It was a cold that didn't belong to this world, a cold that seeped into my bones, into my very soul. We're too late. The voice, the whisper, was no longer a mere suggestion. It was a command, a demand. The shadows outside crept closer, pressing against the fabric, as though they were about to tear through and claim us. I turned to look at my friends, and I could see it in their eyes, the realization that it was already too late. The forest had claimed us. We weren't just visitors anymore. We were part of it. We were part of the darkness. The last thing I remember was the figure stepping into the light. Its face, a twisted, unnatural grin stretching across its skull-like features. The eyes, black and hollow, were fixed on me, on us, and then it spoke, its voice low, deep, resonating inside my skull. Now you belong to the shadows forever. And with that, everything went black. The storm passed. The forest fell silent again, but the camp was abandoned. The tents were left standing, soaked and empty, their flaps blowing in the wind. The fire pit, long extinguished, sat as a cold, empty reminder of what had once been. There was no sign of Sarah, Jake, Mark, or me. No evidence of what had happened that night. Only the quiet remains of the forest, waiting for the next group of campers to arrive. And when they did, the forest would be ready.